y'all hear me? Am I on? All right, everybody. Welcome to the fourth Hawk Talk of the season. Just some quick things. If you have a cell phone, if you could just make sure that it's on silent right now, or if it's on buzz, so that we're not getting any cell phone rings in the middle of this. We have our final Hawk Talk of this semester, the second Thursday of December. I'll be giving a talk on a history of Christmas. But today, we have Drew DeCamp, who is currently the Registrar for the Elkhorn Valley Museum. If you're not familiar with it, it's not too far from us. It's in the direction of downtown, and a fantastic place to check out local history, to check out even more than local history, full statewide history. And there's usually cool events happening there. They just did an event where they took people on graveyard tours this last month, where they told people about the folks who were, I guess, living in those graveyards or dead in those graveyards. Drew got his bachelor's in French from University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2005, and then got his bachelor's in science of history from Wayne State College in 2017. I've had the pleasure of knowing Drew for a couple years now, and in addition to being the museum registrar, he's a deep thinker. He is somebody that has put a lot of consideration into what the heck it is happening now, just with existence. And this is one of the Hawk Talks that as soon as we had worked it out, I got really excited about. So, without further ado, please welcome Drew DeCamp to the podium.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you to Northeast for hosting it. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I know it's the end of the semester, your term papers are due, your finals will be not too long from now, so I'll just get into the talk here. So why did I call it Framing the Past? I was working on a circus exhibit recently, and there was a phrase I really liked when I was reading through some of the correspondence about framing the show for a season, and I thought that's kind of like what we do in museums. We frame exhibits, and it's a big part of our work doing that. So before I go too far into this, I'm just going to start with some definitions. I always think it's important to break things into the simplest components possible when you're starting from the beginning. So one of the older definitions of a museum comes from George Brown Goode, who is the director of the Smithsonian Institution's U.S. National Museum. And he said it's an institution for the preservation of those objects which best illustrate the phenomenon of nature and the works of man, and the utilization of those for an increase of knowledge in the people. And that's kind of an outdated way of looking at a museum, and you can see how it evolves a little bit with the definition from the Museum and Library Services Act, that it's a public or private nonprofit agency or institution organized on a permanent basis for essentially educational or aesthetic purposes that utilizes a professional staff, et cetera, and it owns or utilizes tangible objects, cares for tangible objects, and exhibits the tangible objects to the public on a regular basis. And that's adding in that a museum is the sum of its collection in some ways, and how the collection is interpreted. Later, we get this definition of a museum from the International Council of Museums that adds in that it's for the service of society and its development, that it's open to the public, and that it also conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage, because intangible heritage is something that's more prevalent in the museum world now, and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. And recently, this updated version of the definition of museums came out of the International Council of Museums, and it's based on a lot of what people in the nonprofit world and the museum world kind of wrestled with in the wake of COVID and some of the racial justice protests. It led to a broad rethinking of the way we were doing business in museums. So It adds in that it operates and communicates ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, which that's new, the community participation, and it's something we take pretty seriously at Elkhorn Valley Museum, and offers varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. So you're seeing this evolution of museums into more of a communally oriented space, and less of sort of a distant place for reflection. To kind of go over some of the general history of museums, I wrote up a very broad overview. Collecting goes back a long way to, let's say, Ptolemy the First's collection in Hellenistic Egypt. There was a Neo-Babylonian museum they found at Ur that dates to about the 520s. The Romans obviously spent a lot of time collecting Greek antiquities. Some of what we would think as more modern museums began to coalesce in the Renaissance, like the Medici collection at the Uffizi Palace. The Uffizi is still one of the biggest museums in the world in Florence and one of the most visited, or the Capitoline collection in Rome. Later in the early modern world, collecting led to private collectors putting together what they called cabinets of curiosity, which were basically just collections you'd organize in a cabinet of all kinds of weird and varied stuff. There usually wasn't an overarching theme to it, but some of these collections ended up being gifted to universities, and one of the first organized museums was the Ashmolean at Oxford University. And then imperialism and colonialism led to the creation of national collections like the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Heritage. Kind of what's interesting about the development of museums in the United States is that art museums were more prevalent here, and you think this comes from mostly rich collectors who would put together private collections, and they wanted to share it with the people of their city or their area, and they would create these art museums in perpetuity that would sort of, in some ways, art museums separate art from the context in which they're created. They're about the aesthetic value of the piece more than their background. So EVM is a small museum, and a small museum, according to the American Association for State and Local History, has an annual budget of less than $250,000, a staff that performs multiple functions, and volunteers that fulfill key staff functions. At EVM, both Libby and I, who are the only staff there, both perform multiple functions. So in addition to being the museum's registrar, which I sometimes just call a collection manager, I'm the museum's curator, its preparator, its exhibit designer, one of the visitor experience people. There are about 6 or 7 jobs I could list that I do, and I could do the same for our director, who's also a curator and exhibit designer, so on and so forth, tour guide, fundraiser, et cetera, et cetera. So we are a small museum, but we have what I would say is a mid-sized mission, and our mission is to preserve, interpret, and present the history of the 22 counties in the Elkhorn Valley River region, which is broadly northeast Nebraska, a little bit center east and some of the sandhills, but you can imagine how difficult that is to do with 2 staff members. And in a lot of ways, we've been the Norfolk Museum for a long time, but we have some ambition to change that, and the way we think we're going to do it is by developing partnerships with other museums in the area, both in advisory and an advisory capacity in coordinating activities and events, and also coordinating some of our collecting activities. And if we do that, I think we can start to build the framework that we could actually achieve our mission. So EVM, which is what we call Elkhorn Valley Museum, did receive accreditation by the American Alliance of Museums in 2014, I believe, which is actually a pretty big deal. Accreditation is something that the AAM started to do in 1970 when the museum profession as a whole began to take professional standards more seriously. And that has a lot to do with how these roles in a museum have developed over the years. So if you're interested in working in a museum at some point, this is a good overview of the general roles that are in a museum. So the director of a museum is its face and leader. It oversees all the departments, and they spearhead the large institutional initiatives, do the fundraising. Sometimes they do the grant writing. Our director does grant writing, and they decide how to direct the organization's budget. At EVM, our board directs our budget more than the director in some cases, but at most museums, the director will be directing the budget. The curator is who most people would think of when they think of a traditional role in a museum. They decide what to add to a museum's collection and how to present it to the public through research, exhibits, themes, and outreach. So a good curator has to know both how to collect and connect, they say. And in the past at EVM, our director was also our curator, but now we're dividing that role a bit more equally. The registrar, which is what I am, manages the museum's records and collection, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but I'll get into why the list of duties there can be endless. Archivists, they preserve documents, files, audiovisual materials, and photographs. And educator, that's a position we used to have at EVM. We don't now because our director fills that role more or less. And they interact with the public through guided tours, programming, and written resources. One of my best friends works at Morrill Hall in UNL and is their education coordinator and has developed some amazing written resources for the public and for teachers that go along with Nebraska's curriculum for various levels. And the exhibit designers, who always really impress me, generate the visual elements of an exhibit, and they work with curators and fabricators to bring these to life. That may be graphic design, it may be deciding how the artifacts are going to be presented. There's a variety of things that can go into it, but it's a very specialized role, and Anthony at Flint Hills, who is an exhibit designer I've worked with, is probably one of the most impressive professional people I've ever worked with, just in what he's able to do and bring that together. So EVM is a history museum, and I think, why do I do history? What made me study history? So I just gave you a quote from James Baldwin, who's one of my favorite writers, kind of a kindred spirit. I don't know, it's like when you discover somebody who's had a lot of thoughts that you thought, but you didn't really know how to say them, and then you just find that. It can be amazing. So he says, history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. It does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And yeah, so it's pretty obvious. We do carry history with us, and you could accuse him of a bit of solipsism. That means that the self is the ultimate reality, but in a lot of ways it is our reference point, the self. That's how we experience reality. We don't know what's outside of it except for what we perceive. So history itself is about perception and the shaping of narratives. Stories are the way we make sense of the world. In museums, our job is to tell stories and establish a dialogue with the past through the stories we tell. Knowledge of local history can deepen your understanding of your community. With local politics assuming increasing relevance, it's more vital than ever to understand what forces shaped our communities. And what I was thinking when I wrote this is national politics are obviously gridlocked. A lot of it, both on the left and right, is performative. So what happens at the more local level is, you can actually see the changes that are occurring. So I think understanding where you came from and what shaped your community can help you help you know where to go in the future. And it helps you understand trends in national history on a more micro level. So the Great Depression, World War II, the Dust Bowl, all of that was real here as it was anywhere else. So, okay. Registrars is a profession. I wrote this really long list of all the things the registrar does or may do, and I won't read it all, but it gives you kind of an overview of what could be in a registrar's day. So we manage space, risk, information, and people. By space, I mean the physical environment that the collection's in, but I also mean the information space. By risk, I mean environmental risk, pest risk, can even be political risk or anything like that. And people means all of the physical interactions that people have with the collection, as well as managing staff, managing relationships with your board members, with the public, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the more major roles of a registrar, though, are object handling, photography and imaging of collection items that allows us to track them, cataloging the museum objects, accessioning and deaccessioning collection objects. And I'll stop for a minute and explain what accessioning is, because it's a word we use all the time in the museum world. And when I first started volunteering at EVM, they would say it all the time, and I'd say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So it just means adding things to the collection, more or less. And the permanent collection, more specifically, when you add things to a permanent museum collection, they cease to exist as the objects they were. They'll never be used again in the same way, most of the time. Sometimes, I mean, like at the Met Museum, they let professional lute players play their Renaissance lutes, which I think is really cool. But usually it meant to pull something out of its traditional role and set it aside for posterity. So we also give preventative and conservation care to objects, which we're not conservators, we don't know material science, so we just do the best we can with it. And we also coordinate loans, that's a big part of the job. So, with the museum collection, there's always balance you have to establish between access and accountability. And by accountability, I mean the long-term preservation of an item. So any decision you make in a collection, you have to think, where on this axis am I going to land? Anytime you're handling an object, using it for education, putting it in a display, whatever, you're making a conscious decision to shorten its lifespan. But if you didn't do that, you couldn't interpret the collection and make it available to the public. So you have to make those choices at some point. And those choices are influenced by a museum's policies, priorities, goals, and resources. And those are largely ethical questions, which means that in some ways, everything in a museum is a judgment call. And the museum's director sets the tone for how people are going to interact with your collection, but registrars and collection managers manage the practical expression of those policies. So to give you an example of access versus accountability at EVM, we were redoing our gallery that we have for Johnny Carson last year. And to do that, we had to knock down a couple walls, I think, and rebuild a couple new ones. And we had to do drywall to do that. And if you know much about drywall, the dust gets everywhere. You can't manage it, you can't control it. It's just going to get into everything. So we had to do that to create a new gallery, but it created some problems for a lot of our artifacts. It got into textiles. I spent months cleaning it off of tractors and steam engines and anything you can imagine I was having to try to get this drywall dust off of. But we think the long-term gains we made in accessibility of the collection and making a more relevant exhibit more than outweighed what we lost in the preservation aspect of that. Okay, so continuing with collections, the storage environment we use for collections is based on an idea of, what would you say, sort of enveloping the collection. So we have several envelopes that we try to keep the collection in, which starts with the building envelope. And then within that, you have a storage room, then your shelf or cabinet, then the container itself, and then the materials inside the container. So in that way, you're trying to keep the collection away from agents of deterioration, changes that could be chemical or physical, pest damage, and mishandling even, things like that. So the shelves we use and the cabinets we use for that are ideally some powder-coated steel with an epoxy, acrylic, or polyester finish. It usually looks white. We actually have some of these rolling shelves and a couple of these cabinets at EBM that we got in 2017. So that's pretty impressive for a museum our size, and we hope to get some more of those so we can fix some of our long-term storage solutions. For actually packing up objects, we use chemically inert storage materials, which are acid-free tissue paper, pH-neutral paper boxes and folders, polyethylene foam sometimes for shock absorption, though we don't like to use plastic long-term if we can avoid it. Tyvek and Mylar are also plastic materials we use in the short term just because they're convenient, and like Mylar, for example, has its uses. If you're setting up an exhibit, you can line a plinth with it, people can't see it, and you're protecting the plinth and the object from damage and flaking. The environment for museum collections, we control the temperature, relative humidity, and light levels. The temperature is usually maintained at 72 degrees or less, though with temperature and humidity, it's just more important that the fluctuations are kept to a minimum. So with relative humidity, you'd like it to be between 45 and 55%, but we live in Nebraska, so that's next to impossible. I think last year at EVM it went as low as 8%, which is almost desertification levels when you think about it. Less than 25% is not particularly safe for collections, but you have to work around what you have, so you do the best you can. And sustainability is becoming more prevalent in museums, and working around issues instead of trying to use time, money, and energy to correct things that are essentially, essentially natural. So, like, I talk a bit about integrated pest management here, which is trying to control pests without pesticides. And we don't do that at EVM because at some level it takes a lot of staff and a lot of buy-in, a lot of vigilance. You have to remove the pest food sources and access points. You have to monitor the kind of pests you see, and you have to know their behavior on one level or another to be able to control it. So it would be something I'd like to start at EVM, but we haven't quite got there yet. Okay. The light levels, light can damage things like paper, artworks, textiles, things like that. So that's why we keep our collections in dark storage areas. When you take them out to exhibit them, that can lead to damage from light levels, though we do use LED lighting that is less damaging than incandescent lighting. Okay, so probably what takes up most of a registrar's day is the activity of cataloging. And cataloging is actually adding things to a museum's collection. A catalog is a record of each item with data that identifies and describes it, as well as provides information about condition, marks, the provenance of the item, which, if you don't know what provenance is, it's basically the history of ownership and how it's changed hands over its lifetime, the circumstances of how the museum acquired it, its dimensions, and the place, date, and identity of the maker, where it was found, and the historical context. And one of my favorite subjects in museum studies is the idea of cataloging as a subjective practice. A lot of what you write in a catalog says a lot about you. It says a lot about your museum, the culture you come from. So is it always working to your best advantage to have the same cataloger all the time for all your objects? I don't know. I mean, would it be better if you spread those duties around, let more people be involved with it? Probably, but it's an interesting thing to think about, and I think right now in Spain they have a committee working on ways to kind of democratize cataloging and create a different approach to it. So to do cataloging, we use what we call a collection management system, which in a lot of museums is called either Past Perfect, or there's Preservica or Catalog It, and it's basically a database. And in this database, the catalog records are separated into 4 categories, which are objects, photos, archives, and library. Objects are artworks, decorative arts, just physical objects like leather buckets or what have you. Photos are exactly what they sound like. Archives are unpublished documents, journals, scrapbooks, things of that nature. And library are published items. So at EBM, we catalog everything with a unique identifying number that we call the object number, and it's done in 3 parts. The first 2 numbers in it identify the accession, which is the year and the number of the donation we got in that year. So let's say the 21st donation that came through the door in 2021 that we actually accessioned, that would become the accession number 2021.0021. And then all the objects inside that accession would be sequentially numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. But if you have an object that has multiple elements or accessories, like I gave the example of a bayonet here, you'd catalog it as 1A, 1B, 1C, so that'd be the scabbard, the belt frog, the blade, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you had a makeup kit, you'd probably do the makeup kit as 1A. All the pieces would be B through Z or whatever they end up being. So after we do that, we catalog it, we assign it a number. We mark the objects so they can be tracked physically, because we have to maintain what we call physical and intellectual control of the collection. And this would be a part of both of them, really, because it's keeping track of them physically, but also with their catalog record. I'm sure you've seen object tags, maybe in an antique store or something. They're a paper tag with something written on it. You just fold it up over itself and pull it. So with books, documents, and photographs, you can just use a pencil to put the object number on it, usually on the inside cover with the book or back of a photographic print with a photograph. But objects, like I gave a cannonball as an instance, but it could be a rifle, it could be a basket, whatever, but it really depends on the materials you're working with. With those, we do what's called an acrylic sandwich, and with that we either use a base of clear plastic that we call B72, or we use white acrylic paint. And my personal favorite is white acrylic paint. The number stands out a lot better. I haven't had many good experiences using the clear lacquer, but I understand some people like it. After the paint dries, we apply an archival ink using a Sigma or Sakura Pigma Micron pen. Excuse me, that's a mouthful. And when that dries, we use a substance called B67 over it, which is a clear paraloid thermoplastic acrylic polymer in spirits, and that makes a semi-permanent marking, though there are solvents that can remove that marking because it needs to be durable but removable ultimately. because you never want to leave a permanent mark on your collection items if you can avoid it. But even given that, we still take photographs and write complete descriptions in the catalog, and that creates redundant layers of control for tracking your collection. Okay, so to go over some of the highlights in EBM's collection, we have the Johnny Carson collection, which, as you know, I'm sure Johnny Carson grew up in Norfolk, so we have many objects of his related to The Tonight Show, things from his personal life, and also a lot of photographic prints. His archives are in the National Comedy Center in Jamestown, New York, which is an awesome institution. Their archivist is extremely helpful to us. We just talked to her today about the Carson collection, and she's going to help us develop a grant proposal to take care of it long term, so we really appreciate that partnership. We also started working with the Nebraska Music Hall of Fame in 2019, which is an organization that was founded by a Norfolk man named Jim Casey, who recently passed away. But we keep things in there from people who have been inducted into it, and they induct about 10 groups or people a year, I would say about average, in a ceremony every year in Omaha. So there are always things being added to it. Sometimes we have concerts from the bands in that gallery that we keep that in. The square turn tractor is another one of our biggest attractions. It's the only artifact we've ever paid money to acquire, and it sits at the back of our museum. And the square turn tractor was a kind of technically advanced tractor for the time, in that it could make a 90-degree turn, hence why it was called square turn tractor. And our square turn tractors from 1917, the factory burned down in the 1930s, so they stopped making them, and I think it's one of only 4 in existence. Other significant collections we have are the Carl Steffen and family collection. Carl Steffen was a Norfolk man who was WJAG's original announcer, but also a congressman, and his family must have been pretty well-to-do, because all of the things in the collection kind of show exquisite taste, and are just, they're not like a lot of the other things you see in a local history museum in Nebraska. A lot of historic photos. We have a decent textile collection, particularly women's clothing. A collection of Granada Theater items. The Granada Theater was built in 1927 here in Norfolk. And some other personal items from figures in Norfolk history. So I want to show you some pictures of some of my favorite exhibits that we've done at EBM. Recently, in the past year, we've done Artists in Northeast Nebraska, which was a retrospective of artists that were active from 20 to 60 years ago. That was probably my favorite exhibit I've done at EBM. Laura the Circus, which is about circuses and carnivals in Northeast Nebraska. And we're doing a new acquisitions exhibit that we're opening on the 18th called Curiosities. But here are the pictures. So this is an exhibit called Dress Code that was put together in 2018. And I wasn't working at Elkhorn Valley Museum at the time, but I think this is one of our most interesting exhibits, and it showcases some of our women's textile collections, and it's really well done exhibit, differing sight lines, levels. The lights were purple and yellow. Yeah, the dress on the right is an interesting Philippines national dress that belonged to the Carl Steffen family. So, as I was talking about earlier. That's another picture from Dress Code, and you can see some of the purple and yellow lighting in it. This is some of Artists in Northeast Nebraska, which I hung this exhibit salon style, which means just kind of against the wall in layers in some ways, but there were so many works in it that there really wasn't a better way to approach it. Another picture from that. And this is a picture of part of the Lure of the Circus exhibit. I don't know if you knew this, but we have a carnival that was active in Wayne, Nebraska in the 1920s and 30s called the Walter Savage Carnival. And at one point they had more than 100 staff members. You can see them arrayed in this panoramic photo. And it was really cool to learn some of that history and talk to some of the people in Wayne who knew that family. Then we have an exhibit about the Granada Theater that Libby, our director, put together earlier this year. And it's an interesting design. There's a silver screen here to look like a movie theater screen. We have the seats. We have one of the old carbon arc burning, I think that's what you call it, carbon arc burning cameras. Some pictures of the Granada Theater. So really interesting stuff. So yeah, I guess that concludes my presentation, and I will take any questions you have.
I have a million questions.
All
I
right.
promise not to ask all of them, but I want to give students an opportunity first.
Okay, I have a question.
Go for it.
When you organize it like 2021 00A,
Mhm.
do you have more than Z can go AA, PDs?
Yeah, that's how I've done it before. I haven't had to do it too often, but if I do AA.
All right, I'm going to hold myself to 4.
All right.
First one. You said the United States initially, most of our museums were art museums?
Not initially, but that's how it developed over the years.
Okay, so like
Yeah.
19th century it was,
Mhm.
but Americans are not very artsy compared to like Europeans.
No, I was thinking it's, like I said, I think that came from rich people who decided to be paternal and give these gifts to the community. Like they're thinking, okay, I have $1 billion, I can put together this huge art collection, I'm a connoisseur now, what do I do with it?
So it's less that we have museums that are trying to build history, and it's really just the vanity project.
In some ways, yeah. Though I think they would have taken it seriously.
So, accessioning, that's what it's called, right? When you collect something. And you talked about how, for the most part, it means that that object ceases to do what it did. Like you have the square turn tractor. That's
Exactly.
never going to be
Yep.
used as a tractor again. Does that devalue the object?
Yeah, I think in some ways it does, and that attitude is changing. There's a new philosophy called active collections, and that advocates more use of the object. It advocates looking at what objects are actually useful to your mission, ranking your collection accordingly, and finding more opportunities to connect with the public through the object. Because at a certain point, if you devalue the object and separate it from its original context that much, what does it actually mean? Yeah. So I will admit that I am a proponent of active collections.
I love that idea of you're saying like where like the Met wasn't they have
the Met, they'll play the lute.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
That's beautiful.
So I think both our director Libby and I are both believers in active collecting.
Please, Kristen.
Okay, but it devalues the object for what it was originally made for, but it actually makes it more valuable because now we have a tractor that's 100 years old that there's only 4 in existence, right?
And if we kept using it, we would have destroyed it eventually.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that's the trade-off, like I was saying in the talk, access versus preservation, and you just have to decide where on that axis you sit.
I just want easy answers.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I've learned working in a museum. There are no easy answers. There are only judgment calls, and
that's a good. I only got 2 more. You talked about because the registrar has to manage all these different risks. You know, if you put something out, is that going to eventually it gets worn out? But if you don't put something out on display, what's the point of even having it? But one of the things you mentioned was even political risk.
yeah. And
What does that mean? What counts as
there, I'm thinking of some more problematic collections that a museum might have from the past, like a Native American collection. And a lot of museums are trying to they're putting projects together to review their collections that have questionable provenance or, you know, questionable circumstances of acquisition. Like I know that Jocelyn is hiring a registrar to do a NAGPRA project, which is the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. They want to catalog all their things, talk to the tribes, figure out what they should give back, what has, you know, what has some iffy origin.
Kind of like a lot of European museums that
Exactly,
have stolen
yeah.
things from their colonies.
Right, and a lot of European museums, particularly British museums, are working on decolonializing right now.
All right, so in my last one is you talk about these different jobs. You got the curator, the registrar. I think with the exhibit designer, it just sounds like an artist on staff at a museum.
It is, yeah.
At a large museum, you know, I don't mean like the Met. I mean like something like UNL might have some, you know,
Mm-hmm.
good. How big is a staff? Like,
It depends on their priorities. I think a good example might be the Durham in Omaha. So you may have a collection staff of 5 to 10 people, which would include both your registrars and curators. They might have the social media person or two, a couple educators, maybe a full-time exhibit designer and fabricator. But even at a pretty good-sized museum, you'll still see a staff of 20 or less.
okay. The Met, I imagine, is more than 20.
Yeah, it would be hundreds with plenty of PhD curators and.
But that's the exception.
Stuff. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you so much, Drew, for coming
Yeah,
out.
thank you for listening.
And if I could just go ahead and remind everybody, Dave, would you be willing to share slides if anybody wanted to, like, look these things over? Those, you hold those tight?
Oh no, you can have all the slides. Yeah.
Okay, I will be asking for those, and if anybody else wants some, you can email me, or you can go ahead and just email the museum, or come on down to the museum. And I'll remind us all, December 8th is our final hot talk of the semester. I'll be giving a history of Christmas, which is going to be complex and hopefully enjoyable. Thank you again, Drew, and I will see you all in Monday.
Oh, you'll see me tomorrow.
Well, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow.